Through the ages, war and technology have always marched forward together, side by side. But during the last 100 years, the rapid acceleration of technological expertise has seemed to promise the military more and more.
It's very alluring and tempting to accept the premise that there's a technological fix. We sent a man to the moon, didn't we? Then why can't we defeat ballistic missiles?
Technology has provided armies with the key advantages in defeating an enemy: increased firepower and destructive capability. But recently, technology offers an altogether more seductive possibility: that maximum military gain can be achieved at minimum human loss.
It's something which will prevent you from needing to put your young men, and increasingly your young women, out into the mud.
New technologies promise to make warfare cleaner, smarter, and above all, more precise. But it's a promise that has proved impossible to achieve.
Dropping missiles of any kind upon ground targets, even with all the wonderful technology of the United States, is still a very imprecise art.
The combination of high technology and warfare has produced some of the most startling military blunders of the last 100 years. World War I was technology's first big test in the 20th century. The first great industrial conflict, with the great economies of the West locked in battle. War efforts were expressed in terms of guns and shells. But by 1916, the result was stalemate. The British decided something must be done.
The big push became known as. It was hoped that it would be decisive. It was hoped that a war that had some thought might be over by Christmas 1914, that had dragged on to the end of 1915, could be terminated in 1916.
General Henry Rawlinson developed a plan.
The problem facing Rawlinson's men on the Somme is that the Germans have dug themselves in very well and very securely into a series of trench lines.
Rawlinson envisaged an artillery barrage of an unparalleled force. Millions of shells would rain down on German lines.
Rawlinson decides that the artillery will destroy the barbed wire, destroy the German trenches, kill the German trench garrisons.
Once the shells had done their work, it would be safe for the British soldiers to advance. Minimal casualties were expected.
So it's a classic example of artillery conquers, infantry occupies, and the infantry are not expected to fight for the ground because the guns are expected to have done their work already.
The place chosen for battle, the Somme. In June 1916, the barrage began, with over 1,500 guns brought into action. This was total technological warfare.
The British are firing something like 1.5 million shells the week before the battle. So it's a huge barrage.
The idea of the Germans surviving was unacceptable. They could see the shells falling day after day after day, and they couldn't believe that anything would be left alive.
In fact, it was a countdown to one of the biggest military disasters in history. A disaster which had its roots in the very early days of the war. (1914), 2 years before the Battle of the Somme. Early military losses led to an intense recruitment drive of civilians. Across the country, men left their homes and occupations to join the so-called PALS battalions. The response in Accrington, Lancashire, was typical in helping to form the army which would fight the Battle of the Somme.
When war was declared, the mayor placed an advert in the local newspaper appealing for volunteers for Kitchener's Army, an Accrington PALS battalion. In answer to the mayor's advertisement, in 10 days, over 1,000 men enlisted. There were miners, cotton workers, engineers, and so on.
By the end of 1914, over 500,000 men had joined. But their departure drained the workforce. skilled trades were badly hit, especially the armaments industry. By 1915, a dwindling workforce was making fewer and fewer shells, and it was shells, the high technology of the day, on which the war effort depended. The newspapers got hold of the story, and a political scandal erupted.
This was potent stuff because only just before Asquith, the Prime Minister, had said, on the advice of the War Office, that shell supplies were adequate. So the Prime Minister was caught with his trousers down.
Lloyd George, the greatest political fixer of the day, was called in to sort things out. He immediately set about finding another type of army, workers to man armaments factories.
Lloyd George strikes a bargain with the trade unions at the beginning of 1915, which effectively suspend the right to strike and also allow what was then called the dilution of labour. And what was meant by the dilution of labour was the bringing in of unskilled workers in the place of skilled workers.
It was these workers, raw and inexperienced, who had to produce the sophisticated weapon that was to underpin the big push of 1916, the shell.
Now, this is an 18-pounder shrapnel shell. The shell comprises of a body and a fuse to activate the shell. When you can see how some 17 parts of this fuse have to be machined to extreme accuracy. So almost in the way of a watchmaker producing a precision instrument, come together to produce this very complex fuse which will fail if any single part doesn't function correctly.
The pressure, not just to master technique, but to increase shell output, was intense. The result was disastrous.
Roughly 30% of the shells found at the Battle of the Somme are duds, failed to explode, with predictable results as far as the battlefield is concerned.
By 1916, the PALs and shells travelled together to France in preparation for the Battle of the Somme. Amateurs and duds together. The Accrington PALs took their place on the front at a village called Serre, face to face with the enemy.
The Accrington PALs the trenches were in these copses. They were known as Matthew, Mark, Luke and John Copse. And the German front lines were on the horizon over there. This is what was then no man's land. The distance was very little, but anything from 250 to 300 yards apart, no more than that.
As the PALs prepared for battle, another technological problem emerged. It concerned the great guns firing the vital shells. Before the Great War, guns had been placed in the open, but this had made them vulnerable to enemy fire. To save lives, guns were now placed behind hills or other cover. The guns were now harder to hit, but they couldn't actually see their targets. Now the guns needed to be told where to aim. All their considerable firepower was dependent on the very imperfect state of military communications.
The gun had to be told what to fire at. An observer had to tell it. He had to be given communications, and the best they could do for him was a telephone wire with a telephone, which he had to carry with him into no man's land and ring up the gun and tell it what to do. This was not a very good system.
But there was another technological problem with the shells the guns fired. At the start of the war, shrapnel shells were mass-produced. They were designed for use in open warfare. But the war was now being fought in trenches, and it was the stockpile of shrapnel shells which were being fired on the Somme, making little impact on the German defences.
Shrapnel shell consists of a shell casing full of little tiny hardened steel shrapnel balls which explode in the air and come down in a great shower. They're ideal for killing men in open warfare. But these were pretty useless for destroying barbed wire. Most of them just pinged off the wire. Very, very difficult to cut barbed wire with shrapnel.
As their technology collapsed around them, the British barrage continued remorselessly. It had little effect.
By this stage in proceedings, with the day on which the attack is meant to go in looming, postponing is difficult, and the plan really has become one of those things that it's almost too big and too important to actually stop. Broadly speaking, the message that the High Command is putting out down the chain of command is that the barrage will work.
Commanding officers were parading their men and saying, just go over there and occupy the trenches. You can go over smoking your pipes if you want. And as so often in warfare, you believe what you want to believe.
And everyone believed the technology was working. After 7 days, the barrage halted. July the 1st, 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Technology's first test in the battlefield of the 20th century had arrived. The advance on the German lines was ordered.
Zero hour comes, two things happen. The shelling lifts for a moment off the German front line and falls on the second line and the other targets further back. The whistles are blown and the men come out of the trenches. Up the ladders they go, through a little gap in their own barbed wire that has been prepared for them, and start walking across no man's land.
And they're walking, in most cases, because of the assumption that German defences will have been smashed by artillery.
And the Germans are just 10 or 12 yards away, coming out, standing on top of their parapet, shooting at them, the machine gun is shooting at them.
British soldiers are hit. They're hit by machine gun fire. They're then hit by shell fire. One eyewitness said that they were like calves smelling blood. They're stopped, sadly in their hundreds and thousands, on the wire, the uncut wire, in front of the first German trenches.
Major generals behind them, a mile or so behind, are saying, look, press on, press on. So more and more units are shoveled into the attack.
But as they looked back towards the British trenches, they'd have seen a ghastly sight with the landscape littered with dead and wounded.
And then it all went quiet. And that was the end of the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Except that you've got thousands of men lying out in no man's land, unwounded, sheltering in shell holes, just laying doggo, hoping nobody will spot them, wounded, trying to crawl back, and 20,000 men dead.
It was the largest loss of life in any single day of warfare up to that time. Military technology had failed its first test.
If you expect too much of a technology which has simply not been proven, your soldiers, for whom you were hoping that technology would be an advantage, will be the people who pay the price for technological failure.
Not a single yard of ground was taken at the Serre sector that day. The bodies of the Accrington pals lay unburied for 9 months until the Germans finally withdrew. The British took the empty trenches and buried their dead.
This is Queen's Cemetery. It is in reality a mass grave. As you can see, the headstones are quite close together, as distinct from other cemeteries where there is a distance between them. There are 50 of the pals buried in here who are identifiable. It was a tragedy, and this place evokes a sense of sadness and of loss, which is unequalled.
When the Great War was over, 8 million combatants had been killed. The public revulsion at such losses encouraged military thinkers to consider how such costly and wasteful battles could be avoided in the future.
The British theorist Major General J.F.C. Fuller says that he wants battles which are going to be works of art, not daubs of blood. Technology is one of the ways in which Western governments and their armies think about trying to avoid a rerun of what had happened on the Western Front in the First World War, using technology instead of flesh and blood to keep the enemy out.
And despite its failure in the First World War, it was technology which provided an answer. Above all, it was the technology of air power which seemed to promise solutions. The bomber dream was being created. In the aftermath of World War I, the search continued for a kind of warfare that would avoid its carnage. Air power seemed to hold all the answers.
Probably the most important and original debate that took place between the two world wars was sparked by the airmen. They were arguing that this extraordinary new technology, the means of flight, had created the means to pass over all the traditional horrors, the mud and blood of the battlefield, and to offer a vision of victory which seemed deceptively seductive to a generation who were haunted by what they just endured between 1914 and 18.
A newly formed RAF actively promoted what became known as the bomber dream. Bombers would take warfare right into the heart of the enemy's territory. They would be impossible to stop, as they were fully equipped to defend themselves.
It was going to be self-defending bomber formations. The bombers were going to go on their own, and they'd got these hydraulically operated machine gun turrets, and they were going to defend themselves.
Once airborne, the bombers were expected to carry out attacks with surgical precision. And it was factories, not people, that were to be the targets.
If you could bomb the enemy industrial capacity to such an extent that the supplies cease to reach the fighting front, the enemy collapses from within. So Bomber Command was going to attack accurately the German industrial capacity. You can't fault the strategy or the optimism. What I call the bomber dream was of the highest principles.
The practice proved very different. With the outbreak of the Second World War, the bomber dream faced its first big test. Frank Metcalf was trained to fly Blenheims, one of the bombers in which such great hopes were invested. In the summer of 1940, Frank went to join his squadron.
And I arrived at the squadron, and my crew reported into the adjutant, which was the thing you did. And he said, "Oh, nice to see you. Get yourself a room. The boys are out on a show. They've gone to raid a German fighter aerodrome in Aalborg in Denmark." No one came back. That was day one, not exactly a great welcome. My crew and I were petrified, frankly, terrified.
Frank discovered that the self-defending bomber was the first myth of the bomber dream to crumble.
Our losses were simply horrendous by daylight. Why? The Blenheim had one Vickers K gun in the back. We were faced with ME-109s who could do 350, 360 with 8 machine guns in the front. We had no chance to be caught by the fighters, none. So we tried to hide in cloud. I don't think I ever saw a cloud in that period.
Bomber crew losses were very high. The technology on which they were dependent was simply not up to the job.
But the truth was that the RAF had failed technically to come anywhere near matching the dream of air power before the war, and yet all through 1940 and into 1941, the RAF continued to dispatch the Blenheim on almost suicidal raids, which they were shot down in huge numbers, because they felt they had to be doing something rather than doing nothing.
Increasing losses led to a reassessment of the bombing tactics. Night missions were introduced. It was hoped hiding the bombers under the cover of darkness would help, and for a while, the losses were reduced. But it seemed this had been achieved at the cost of bombing accuracy. Intelligence reports said targets in Germany were not being hit. In the summer of 1941, an alarmed British government asked a career civil servant, David Butt, to investigate.
He examined photographs in which the crews had claimed to have bombed the target. During the Moon period in Germany, he found that only 1 in 4 of those was within 5 miles of the target. In non-Moon periods, the figure was only 1 in 20 within 5 miles of the target. In other words, Bomber Command was not hitting its targets.
Bomber Dream's promise of precision exposed at the stroke of a civil servant's pen. The shockwaves were felt in the highest of offices.
It came as a very bitter shock to Winston Churchill and the politicians. In many cases, when they dispatched raids, the Germans were barely aware of what target the RAF had intended to attack because so few of their bombers had got anywhere near it. They'd ended up dropping bombs all over Germany.
The Bomber Dream's lack of precision created a precarious situation. Since Dunkirk, the bomber had been Britain's only way of waging war in Europe. Her very ability to prosecute war against Hitler was now in question. In the spring of 1942, a solution emerged.
And that, of course, is area bombing. And area bombing does kill large numbers of people. And it's ironic that the RAF, who started out with these high ideals of not having people killed, finish up killing a lot of people.
Area bombing held out none of the promises precision targeting had offered in minimizing civilian casualties. In the firestorms that resulted, civilian non-combatants, the very people precision bombing had been designed to spare, were at the very heart of the destruction the bombers now rained down on German cities.
What happens? The high explosive in the early part of the raid destroys a few houses, throws the rubble into the street, craters a few roads. Their job is to stop the fire engines getting around town. Your big blast bombs blows in the windows over a wide area, removes the roof covering. Twinkling little 4-pound incendiaries fall in large numbers into the rafters because the roof's gone. Start a fire up there. All through the raid, your 500-pound high explosive bombs are dropping, and at that stage they are designed to deter people from coming out and fighting the fires. But the fire will spread, so all these bombs have got a particular role. Bomber Command has become a force of mass property destruction.
Area bombing killed over 500,000 civilians in Germany, a failure for technology's central promise of saving lives.
The British and Western public still love to cling to certain myths. Now, one of the myths they really like is that the First World War was a bloody catastrophe, and that somehow in the Second World War, with modern technology and so on, we found the means to avoid the bloody catastrophe, to win, to defeat the evil of Nazism at far lower cost in lives. Well, this, of course, is a monstrous lie, that the loss of life in the Second World War was far greater than in the First World War. All that was different was that we, the British and the Americans, paid a far smaller share of the price, that the price still had to be paid.
A quarter of a century later, in Vietnam, and the Americans were still trying to conduct precision warfare. But in terrain like this, precision had no meaning. The Americans could not even see their enemy. They were hidden beneath the cover of Vietnam's jungles, and American lives were being lost, including those on boat patrols in Vietnam's maze of rivers, where the casualty rate was especially high. Admiral Zumwalt was the man in charge. He turned to technology as a means to stop the losses.
The average young man had a 70% probability of being killed or wounded during his year's tour. We simply had to do something, and that was the use of Agent Orange to defoliate the banks. And we therefore thought that it was a marvelous solution to a very serious problem.
Agent Orange was an early form of biotechnology. Essentially a weed killer, 12 million gallons was dropped to defoliate the riverbanks and jungles of Vietnam. But it was an unstable mixture, contaminated with a deadly agent.
The Agent Orange, which was ordered by the U.S. military, was a not very purified mixture. It was a mixture which allowed dioxins to be formed. Dioxins are considered among the most toxic chemicals ever made by man, molecule for molecule. Dioxin is fat soluble. If, for example, it's swallowed in food, it will be absorbed and it will be slowly released. Dioxins could be looked on as a time bomb waiting to go off to do its damage.
As late as 1969, the American government was still assuring its troops that Agent Orange was safe to use. Admiral Zumwalt believed them. He was so certain, he ordered the dropping of the defoliant around serving US naval crews, which included his own son, Elmo.
So he was exposed, along with many of his comrades, to the spraying operations. They ate the food that had been sprayed and they drank the water that had been sprayed, so that the Navy men were heavily exposed.
1 year later, Agent Orange was withdrawn. Tests showed mice exposed to it dying of cancer. In 1975, the Americans pulled out of Vietnam, leaving a country ravaged by the effects of Agent Orange. Huge tracts of land were polluted with deadly dioxins, and the people living on the land suffered terribly, including those the Americans had been there nominally to protect. Among the South Vietnamese population, a pattern of birth defects and cancers emerged. But the long-term effects of Agent Orange were not to be confined to Southeast Asia. Admiral Zumwalt returned home. He was promoted to the most senior post in the American Navy, the Chief of Naval Operations. He retired. It was then the legacy of his Vietnam years returned to haunt him and his son.
In 1983, I received a call from Elmo telling me that he was suffering from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. It came as a terrible shock to all of us. He then became terminal. It was clear that Elmo's wife, Kathy, who had been caring for him at home, was getting very tired, so our son, Jim, and I went down to give her a couple of weeks rest. Our son, Jim, took the first night duty, spending the night in the room with Elmo. Jim woke up at 6, suddenly heard Elmo stop breathing and awakened the rest of us, and that was the end.
The use of Agent Orange had turned out to be a particularly insidious form of friendly fire. Thousands of ex-soldiers were diagnosed with health defects years after battle. Chemical companies who had manufactured Agent Orange paid millions of dollars in compensation, but the American government refused to admit liability. Admiral Zumwalt investigated. He found a government allied to technology and willing to defend its interests, even when, as in the case of Agent Orange, things had gone wrong. Admiral Zumwalt was leaked a memo circulating around government departments,
which in essence said to them it would be most unfortunate if any correlation between dioxin and health effects were found, because it would be costly to compensate Vietnam veterans. An absolutely flagrant admission of a design to corrupt, in my judgment.
Finally, in 1991, the American government conceded its responsibility for the use of Agent Orange. No compensation has ever been paid to the people of Vietnam who suffered at its hands. At America's memorial to the soldiers who died in the conflict, the casualties of Agent Orange are not listed among the dead.
I made considerable effort to get support from the Pentagon for some way of recording the names of those who died later from the effects of Agent Orange, and General Powell had to write me a very thoughtful letter declining to construct an adjacent memorial.
In the same year that the American government came clean about Agent Orange, it was becoming embroiled in another war. A war in which military might and technological know-how seemed finally to have come of age. It was 1991, and the Gulf War was beginning. (1991) Desert Storm. Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait provoked a swift response from the West. Right from the outset, the military insisted this was going to be a different kind of war. Advanced technology would make it surgical, safe, and above all, smart.
I'm now going to show you a picture of the luckiest man in Iraq. Keep your eye on the crosshairs. And now in his rearview mirror.
The technology was symbolized by a technical hero, the Patriot missile, blowing Iraqi Scud missiles out of the sky in a show of accuracy which was hypnotic. After achieving the first missile-to-missile strike in military history, it impressed everyone, including those in the highest of offices.
Patriot is 41 for 42. 42 Scuds engaged, 41 intercepted.
It was a strike rate also applauded among American troops, bewitched by the protection they believed offered by the Patriot.
The confidence was there because we knew the Patriots were in the area. And due to the sirens, you knew the Scud was there, but it just got relaxed over the whole thing.
The Patriots' role even expanded into politics. From the outset of war, Saddam Hussein had sought to draw Israel into the conflict by attacking her cities with Scud missiles. The Americans, desperate to keep Israel on side but out of the war, offered their strongest bargaining card, the Patriot missile.
What the Americans were saying was that within 24 or at most 48 hours they would put an end to the missile threat, that there would be no reason for Israel to retaliate.
The Israelis accepted the deal, and the war ended without their direct involvement. The Patriot returned home, basking in success, and created its own particular dream. Finally, the ghosts of a century's technological failures in the battlefield could be laid to rest. Technology had been put to the test of precision and passed. A few months after the war's end, an inquiry began at one of the most prestigious technical universities in the world. A confident Congress wanted to know what lessons could be learned from the Patriot's success. Professor Ted Postel was asked to carry out the examination. What he found surprised him.
I quite frankly believed at the time that Patriot had worked. I began to collect television video taken during the Gulf War. And then it became clear that it wasn't even close to intercepting any targets, yet alone some targets.
Postel gradually became convinced that the Patriots' reputation was not borne out by close scrutiny of actual encounters.
Okay, here we see two Patriots rising up in an attempt to intercept a Scud that'll be coming from the upper left. Each one burns out. We'll see the Scud arrive. There's a miss, second miss, and then it goes onto the ground where we know it exploded. Here we have another example in Riyadh. We'll see a Scud coming from the upper right. There's a miss, a breakup, a second miss, and then the warhead goes onto ground. This engagement was claimed as a success by the US government, and it is still being claimed to be a success.
According to Postel, a fault in the Iraqi Scud caused it to break up in its descent, creating multiple targets. Crucially, the Patriot could miss the Scud warhead, hitting the debris instead. But it still gave the impression of success. Postel maintained that even when the Patriot got near the warhead, it was too late.
So basically what you have is a crossing speed of about 3.5 kilometers per second. You could imagine the radar sensing that the Scud warhead is nearby. Under those conditions, there would be a short delay in time. Then the Patriot would explode its warhead, exploding fragments out. Now you can see right away that even if I sense the warhead at the right time with the radar fuse, and there's any delay at all, this would be a tenth of a thousandth of a second, 1/10,000th of a second. The fragments, under the most ideal conditions, would still hit the back end of the Scud. It would not actually hit the warhead.
Postel's findings, although disputed by the US Army, revealed a very different picture of the Gulf War. Despite the accolades, the Patriot had repeatedly failed to intercept Scud warheads, including those falling onto Israeli cities. A failure seen in the Patriot's very first test of hitting a Scud in Israeli skies.
You know, in the sky it looks very, very slow target. And after a few seconds, I heard the launching of the Patriot. After, I think, 30, 40 seconds, I heard the bomb. I saw a very big bright flash in the sky. I thought that the Patriot hit the Scud, but after a few seconds, I saw the warhead fall in the area of Tel Aviv, and then we started to see what's happened.
As Scud warheads continued to rain down, Israel's concern about Patriot failure began to mount. Washington, D.C., a month into the war, continued Scud attacks were pushing Israel closer to declaring war against Iraq. High noon. Israel sent her defense minister for a face-to-face showdown with the most powerful man in the world.
We met in the Oval Office, and it was a rather tense meeting because Bush did not like the idea at all of Israel taking military action. And he also felt that the Patriots were providing an umbrella defending the Israeli population, so what was all the excitement about? He didn't accept my figures. As a matter of fact, my figures were optimistic. I told him at the time that the probability of an intercept by Patriot was no more than 20%. Well, by now we know it was close to 0%. And he thought it was close to 100%. So there was a little gap.
The next day, President Bush's confidence in the Patriot remained unshaken.
And with the arrival of Patriot battalions in Israel, all told, Patriot is 41 for 42. 42 Scuds engaged, 41 intercepted.
The war was drawing to a close, meaning Israel had no need to engage. And in the event, a final tragedy hit closer to home. In Dhahran, only 3 days from the conclusion of the war, a Scud began to fall towards a warehouse housing American troops.
And the siren had gone off the one time, Nobody did too much about it. I remember seeing it hit the ceiling, the sparks flying from the electric line. We heard it hit the concrete floor. It sounded like a bus had fell down through there. And I remember watching the wall and the ceiling separate from the door. The heat, the blinding light, the blast of air. You could actually taste it, if you know what I mean. I knew just to stay put.
Get out of here with that damn thing! Get out of here right now! Get out of here! Get him out!
We carried the dead people primarily to one spot, and I would go out and give last rites and prayers over them. Had no idea who they were, because so many of them were burnt so bad. One of my men carried out a girl, and he said, she's alive, what do I do? And he looked at her, and part of her head was missing. And he just went wild. I mean, nobody expects to see this in their lifetime.
28 people died at Dahran, and scores were injured. The Patriots' failure to intercept the fatal Scud was blamed on computer error.
A general had come to the hospital and explained to me what had happened. And the Patriot is obviously computer operated, and there was software in the computer that had to be changed every 14 to 17 hours. And they had a glitch, they had problems with the software, and the particular Patriot battery that was watching our area had been up for over 100 hours. So the story I got was it never even really had picked up on the Scud itself, it never fired or anything.
The Patriots' failures were seen as isolated events. In America, confidence was undented. Huge amounts were invested in developing similar systems to fight future wars.
The overall efforts to develop national missile defense increased by $1 billion because of the Patriots' performance.
Joseph Cirincione, a congressional committee investigator, wasn't convinced. He began gathering evidence for a forthcoming congressional hearing. Like Professor Postel before him, when he examined the Army's data on the Patriots' performance, he found failure classified as success. Even the very first Patriot interception of a Scud, which made its reputation, had, according to Cirincione, never happened. The Army, however, argued otherwise.
They were positive that they had hit a Scud, and as proof, they said, they had recovered Scud debris from the site. Since that didn't correlate at all with the rest of the data, we asked that that piece be retrieved and examined, given a metallurgical examination. About 2 months later, the report came back that no, they couldn't really identify it as a piece of the Scud. No, it didn't have any writing on it, that it was a piece of metal that an officer was bringing home as a souvenir. He thought it was a piece of a Scud, but that's all it was, his impression.
Cirincione concluded that false signals from nearby aircraft had caused the Patriot to fire accidentally into the sky, a sky with no Scuds in it. Washington, D.C. A year after the end of the Gulf War, and the congressional hearing into the Patriots' performance was taking place. The Army was still maintaining success.
The Army came up and actually had a fairly bad showing. It didn't tell its story well, and they tended to generally circle the wagons and insist that their story was correct, that the Patriot had intercepted Scuds.
But it was the Army's very particular definition of interception which began to dominate proceedings.
So the Army claimed that the Patriot had intercepted Scuds.
As a kill. It just means that a Patriot and a Scud crossed path their paths in the sky.
And Chairman Kanye said, wait a minute, let me get this straight. Intercept doesn't mean it actually hit it. It just meant that they passed each other like ships at sea. Yes, said the general, that's correct.
But for the Army, the stakes were high. As they themselves admitted, the existing commitment was just too great for them to concede that the Patriot had failed.
What matters to us is for us to validate that the growth program that we have for the Patriot of the future to defend our soldiers in the future is on the correct azimuth, and we believe that.
The US government backed the Army's line. With an additional $1 billion already invested, no one wanted to admit they might be wrong, or to be seen to be skimping on national defense.
There was tremendous pressure to give the troops the best technology you can afford, even if the best turns out to be much more difficult to achieve than you originally thought. So government coffers open up to pay for the latest technology.
The use of technology was still as potent as ever by the time of the next international crisis. In Kosovo, the Allies maintained from the outset that sophisticated air power held the key to victory. No ground troops would be deployed. In an echo of the bomber dream of the 1940s, precision bombing was expected to deliver maximum political impact at minimal human loss.
It was thought that they could solve complex human, social, political problems on the ground in Kosovo from a flight level of 15,000 feet and a speed of 450 knots. Of course, it was a total failure.
In practice, precision bombing proved as hard to achieve in 1999 as it had done 50 years before.
I again stress, NATO deeply regrets the loss of life from this tragic accident.
NATO was forced to change its tactics, just as Bomber Command had done in World War II.
They said, we are not at war with the Yugoslav people. They then started to widen their targets to go for what they call military civilian targets, which included apparently petrol stations, bridges, power stations, water plants, and they found themselves out to be at war with the Serb people, something they said at the start they would not do.
And whilst the war in the air proved inconclusive, events on the ground got worse. In Kosovo, 1 million people were forced from their homes.
I said on the first day we're engaged in a race between NATO's technology and the ethnic cleansing policies of the Serbs. And that was a race that NATO lost because NATO attempted to play the game by the old rules of the air war fantasists.
The war in Kosovo showed how little a century of warfare has taught strategists about the dangers of over-reliance on military technology. Surgical precision, the holy grail of 20th century military strategy, remains as elusive in 1999 as it did in 1916. Whatever the successes of the air war in Kosovo, they were not achieved in the clean, smart, surgical way promised. And just as it was 100 years ago, it's the people on the ground who paid the price.
NATO, in its use of air power, actually killed, I think, 3 times more innocent civilians, both Kosovo Albanians and Serbs, than they did Serb military. I think you are actually running a grave risk of being in violation of the Geneva and the Hague Protocols, which require competence in war to be mindful of the security of the lives of civilians.
Nobody's yet found a way of winning wars against a powerful enemy without a terrible cost in human life. All you can have is an argument about who pays the price, whose lives are lost.